Carbon capture. That will be carbon capture. Okay, so already we're engaging a little bit of magical thinking because carbon capture is not ready for that role yet. But hey, you know what? We don't need it to be ready until 2040. Magical thinking, by 2040, we'll figure it out. Okay, what about all the rest? What about all the electricity? Well, a lot of those processes I was describing rely heavily on green hydrogen fulfilling lots of roles as a reducing agent in certain chemical reactions, as a feedstock for ammonia and methanol, maybe as an energy storage, right? Well, how are we doing on the economics and kind of feasibility of massive electrolysis of green hydrogen? Okay, a little bit of magical thinking might be required to get us over that hump too. But okay, let's just keep going with our thought exercise, right? Then we get into the one you just asked about. Do we even have enough copper, molybdenum, nickel, all these critical minerals and metals? And that's where the critical thinking, where the magical thinking becomes really tricky, at least at the moment. It requires you to say, because lithium will become a bottleneck, sodium-ion batteries will take over.
Before we dive in, a quick whisper about today's sponsor, Ghost Founder. You know that moment when an idea jumps from someday to why not today? Ghost Founder lives in that moment. Ghost Founder takes the sketch from your napkin, gives it a heartbeat, and walks it out into the world. Fast. While everyone else is still writing pitch decks, the ghosts are wiring prototypes, lining up seed investors, and tuning your ops. Product market fit isn't just a hope, it's an outcome. If you're the kind of renegade who refuses to wait for permission, visit ghostfounder.com. Because around here, we scope things, build things, and fund things, in that order. Ghost Founder, the quiet engine behind loud breakthroughs.
Today, we're joined by David Fishman, a longtime China resident and one of the sharpest observers of the country's transformation on the ground. Originally, he's from the US, and David has earned his MA at the Hopkins Nansing Center and has spent more than a decade in Shanghai. Through his Substack, Crossing the River by Feeling the Stones, he takes us into the less covered corners of China's story. Poverty alleviation, rural tourism, solar deployments, and the rise of small city dynamics. David doesn't just write, he also works in the trenches of China's energy sector at the Lantau Group, advising multinationals on everything from renewable procurement to nuclear and ultra-high voltage transmission. He's someone who understands not just the theory, but the engineering realities behind how modern societies keep the lights on. We're going to talk about China, yes, but more broadly about what happens when you anchor policy in the real world and why that matters for something as personal as individual freedoms, right? So trying to bridge a little bit of why does all this even matter to the theme of our podcast, which is how people, can have a free and prosperous life. David, thank you so much for taking the time to join us today.
Thank you for having me, guys. It's a pleasure to be here.
Cool, David. Then let me kick it off, okay? I'm pretty active on Twitter, right? And I've been following people that have been giving takes on China for nearly a decade now. And what got you on my radar was I was looking at this Western guy that was giving his comments on what China is and what China's doing, and you're like one of the really, really few that I feel is giving an accurate picture of what's happening on the ground. So that's why I was so excited when we could get you on the show. So thanks for coming on. My first question, how did China get on your radar? What set you on this path?
Yeah, I mean, I come from a pretty rural, pretty not international part of the United States. I'm from Maine, the state of Maine in the Northeast. And growing up, I didn't really have a lot of diversity around me, diversity of people, diversity of cultures, diversity of lifestyles. And so when I went off to college, I just wanted to, see what was different in the world. I went to school in Atlanta. I wanted to study a foreign language. I just wanted to study something very far away from what I knew. And we always know that, the other side of the world is Asia, right? You dig a hole, keep digging, you'll come out somewhere in China. And so that was really just the idea is like, it's going to be something totally different. It's going to be so unique. And so that's how I got into studying Chinese. And then I liked it. I studied abroad in Beijing. I really enjoyed my time there. I enjoyed the study abroad experience. I enjoyed the learning. And there was a very positive feedback loop about learning Chinese and getting better at it. And of course, I was absolutely horrible at the beginning, but getting better at it and then getting positive feedback from people, which made me want to, study harder and getting more opportunities related to that. And so it was a virtuous cycle. So after I graduated, I wanted to come back. I found the Hopkins Nanjing program, which was, a great opportunity to come back and keep doing educational pursuits, but also be in country and be setting myself up for whatever I was going to do next. I discovered energy was really important to me while doing that degree and just found my first job after school in the energy sector and have never left.
Was it hard to find that first job? How did it work? I would imagine is a Chinese organization? Or
Yeah, well, at the time, so this was 2014. It was still pretty tricky to get a work visa in China without postgraduate work experience. There was a little bit of a catch-22, I guess, in that even if you were graduating from a Chinese university as a foreigner, and the Hopkins Nanjing Center is a dual degree program, so I have a master's degree from Nanjing University as well. But I was not qualified on the basis of work experience. So it was very tricky. And a lot of the people from my cohort that year could not find jobs in China and ended up having to go back and looking for jobs elsewhere. I got quite lucky. I found a small company that was very flexible, willing to, smudge some of the details of my past employment history. And, all of that is moot now because very reasonably so, the educational and employment authorities in China added an exception that said, if you got your degree from a Chinese university, we can waive that obligation for postgraduate work experience. You've already shown a commitment to wanting to be in country. Please stay, find a job here. We'd like to keep you.
Yeah, just from policy perspective, it makes a ton of sense. So I'm from Germany originally, just to give you background on myself, and I studied as a visa student in the US. And it's incredibly difficult also to navigate it on the other side of the planet, right? Getting job offers usually is not that hard, but finding an employer that's willing to work through the bureaucracy and the paperwork is always a bit of a challenge. And then also the regulations, they change frequently. Nobody really knows what the rules are. It's a mess. But I found it worthwhile figuring it out.
And wait, hang on, just before we go. So and getting the job, actually, like, were you interviewing with a local person, like a Chinese person, or how did that happen?
My first job in China was here in Shanghai. It was with a consultancy similar to I work in a consultancy now, right? But at the time, it was a very niche boutique consultancy focused on the nuclear power sector, and so it was an American-owned company, but operating here in Shanghai with a mix of expat and local staff as consultants. Okay. And we were working with American companies in the nuclear power sector, mostly Westinghouse's supply chain, because at the time Westinghouse had just sold some nuclear reactors to China, and all of Westinghouse's supply chain was quite keen to get in on the action and get over to China, start selling equipment, start selling technical services to this huge fleet of nuclear power, of Westinghouse designed reactors that they were expecting was going to be built.
Understood.
The way you just phrased that makes me want to ask, so did they not end up building them the way they thought?
They built a few. The first few did not go as well as the Chinese nuclear industry was accustomed to having its nuclear builds go, which at that point had pretty much all been built on time and within budget. And these were first-of-a-kind reactors, an unproved, untested design. A lot of the supply chain stuff was coming from the United States still. And although they were marvelous pieces of equipment, marvelous technology, they were slow. And while they were building slowly, eventually some Chinese indigenous technology also got up to that level. So in the end, the ambitions of 30 or 40 or 50 Westinghouse AP1000 reactors have been pared back quite a lot. They're still building some beyond the initial 4. There's maybe like 8 or 10 or 12, but not quite the 30 that were originally imagined.
Yeah, so from what I read on the topic, there's and correct me if I'm wrong, but there's a uniquely, like a thoroughly Chinese design, essentially, that is instead going up. Is that correct?
That's right. The bulk of the future builds will be this, the Hualong or the HPR 1000 And it's the same thing. And it's a fully Chinese designed reactor. They own 100% of the IP, 100% of the supply chain or almost 100%. Maybe some small components are still imported, but it's really very localized and therefore much more attractive to the planners, the sector planners looking to deploy dozens of these things.
Yeah, and so I had the privilege of being at a meeting at Westinghouse. I can't recall the name of the town right now. Ground State. It was right before the election last November. It was not a pleasant time to
Was
be
it
there.
in Georgia?
But, yeah, I need to look it up. But anyway, we had a presentation and they walked us through their small modular reactor designs and etc. So it was really cool. And they've been in this interesting situation. While Westinghouse has some of the world leading quality of design, they haven't been able to build any of them in the US, right? I think maybe
in
one
the end.
or
They built
yeah.
a 2-unit reactor or a 2-unit plant. I think it's a phase, actually, a later phase of the Vogtle nuclear power plant in Georgia. But that's the only 2 they got through and completed. They had 2 others that were under construction at VC Summer in South Carolina, I believe, but those have now been stalled. I think there might be some talk about restarting those potentially right now because of the data center and energy demand boom. For now, those are kind of stopped mid process.
Yeah, but so the AP1000 is really the only front to end builds were in China. Is that correct?
Well, the two in Vogtle in Georgia,
Right.
and then
Okay.
so far 4 and many more under construction in China.
Right. And then, but so with the new HPR 1000s in China, the construction time is like way less, right? So they can put these together much quicker.
Yeah, I think the AP1000s could probably get to that same point with enough iteration and with enough practice, right? We always distinguish between first of a kind and N of a kind, just an infinite iteration. So first of a kind is always going to be slower, or almost always going to be slower, and then N of a kind, which is what China is very good at doing, scaling and iterating, become faster. I would expect the subsequent AP1000s in China to be much faster than those first ones, but those Hualong ones, yeah, even the first ones were pretty fast, and they're consistently cranking these out. Construction time frame about 62 to 64 months, something like that. But there's always work before the construction and a little bit of work after the construction. So the whole build cycle, including all the pre-construction work, might be 8-10 years, even longer. Environmental impact reports and geological site surveys and things like that. But civil construction, which is usually the most painful slowdown in the process for Western world, or has been at least in recent years, has been really, really optimized in China.
For our audience for those that are not technically so aware, right? Could you explain it like to a 10-year-old or 15-year-old? Why the big difference between a Hualong 1 and an AP1000?
In terms of the build cycle and construction or performance?
Construction.
Okay.
Actually, you could also go into performance if you like, but just in terms of getting that from, breaking ground to getting it running, why is it so different?
Yeah, well, so when you are building a nuclear power reactor, you are demanding the needs of thousands of skilled personnel, of skilled equipment, production, of welders, of fabricators. And all of these things are things that get better and faster and cheaper the more you do of it, the more scale you have. So that's one big part of it, just that because China has been building more and has been doing it more recently, you have more experienced people who have been doing it with lots of recent experience that can do it faster. But when it comes to the production, individual equipment, pipes and pumps and valves and major equipment like the reactor pressure vessel and the steam generators, these are all things that are produced in China already at mass scale, many of them, many units per year. And so the unit cost is lower. And then we talk about things like the cost of capital, right? You got to take out a bunch of loans to build this thing. The cost of capital in China for the builders, for the developers, will be lower than the cost of capital in other countries. When you talk about some of the timelines themselves, when you take out a massive loan, we're talking billions of dollars, the interest on that loan can be $1 million a day. which means any slowdown in just the approvals and the regulatory and the oversight process. If I've got 20 documents on my shelf on my desk to review and it takes me 5 days to review it, well, for the developer, that's 5 days of interest payments, right? So everything is more condensed about the review and regulatory process as well, which also helps to slow down the appreciation of that interest of that. It's all of these things coming together. Labor costs are lower, equipment costs are lower, cost of capital is lower, construction is faster. Every single piece of that like stacked bar of where the total is costs is condensed a little bit. And so the whole result is also condensed in terms of time and in terms of costs. And then that's not necessarily for HPR 1000 versus AP 1000. I think I was describing there just the Chinese approach to building nuclear and why China is able to build nuclear cheaper than other places. If China was able to apply more and more that same approach to the AP 1000, I do think the costs of the AP 1000 would also be condensed and would come down over time. Maybe not quite as much as the HPR 1000 is, because you're still maybe relying on some overseas suppliers. Maybe a part doesn't fit, and so instead of sending it down the road to the producer who is located in the same province, now you have to ship it back across the ocean and get a repair made, and they ship it back across the ocean. Things like that can still slow it down. But I do believe that China could condense the AP 1000 build cycle quite a bit if they had more opportunity to, if they were going to build them at cost. In terms of performance, they're very similar. They're third generation reactors. Third generation is just a denominator in nuclear technology. Second generation was something that started around the 1970s, 1980s, and lasts through to now. They have certain performance characteristics and certain safety features. Third generation is an improvement on those performance characteristics and those safety features. In terms of the engineering, the quality of the engineering itself, this is very anecdotal, but I have heard Chinese engineers tell me they think the AP 1000 is a more technologically impressive. They're very proud to have their own indigenous IP, but that the AP 1000 is a really impressive piece of technology. And it's a shame that it won't be built as much as it could have in China. Not that there's anything wrong with the Chinese one. It's just maybe the Chinese one meets the minimum requirements to be considered a third generation. Whereas the AP 1000 was like, wow, what a marvelous piece of technology. That's very anecdotal. That's what I've just heard from some Chinese engineers in the industry.
Whoa, thanks for breaking that down. So interesting.
How would you say? Yeah. So, sorry. How would you say So, I mean, other than the regulators being more efficient in their process, would you say that the rules are lax in China, and that's why they get them built faster versus other places?
I haven't seen that. In fact, there's an interesting thing that China practices, and actually most countries around the world, when they are starting up their nuclear industries, also practice. Nobody likes to be the first to try to do anything. Nobody likes to be the guinea pig when it comes to nuclear regulation. So they always, when they're trying to devise a new policy or a new regulation, they look to what already exists in the most mature industries, which in this case is the USA and France. And then they apply that directly, or they apply that and then a little bit more conservatively. And a little bit more conservatively will be because somebody asks, well, why was it done like that in France? And if they don't know why, they'll say, we can't explain why that threshold was at that number, so we've made it 5% more conservative just to be safe. This is part of an international nuclear safety culture, and it's a culture of conservatism, which gets lots of industries into these positions where they're just constantly becoming more and more conservative in order to justify why they're making any choices at all. And that's all that I've seen from the Chinese industry as well. If anything, that they err on the side of over caution and over conservatism. That has been a frequent complaint that I've heard from the engineers and the developers when talking about their relationship with their regulator, right? The Chinese National Nuclear Safety Authority, which oversees the NNSA, the equivalent of the US NRC, which oversees their work. They live in fear of the NNSA. It's an overbearing regulator that makes them do lots of work. That's what a regulator should be, right? A regulator should cause the people in the industry to live in a little bit of fear of them.
Yeah, I mean, it definitely doesn't sound like they're building helter-skelter unsafe reactors, right? So, I mean, that would be probably
Well, fingers crossed, not yet, right?
Yeah.
We haven't had any significant events. The international, what is it? I think it's the IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Authority, ranks nuclear incidents and accidents on a scale of 0 to 7. And I don't think China has ever experienced anything higher than a 2, I want to say. We're on that scale. 3 Mile Island was a 5. Fukushima and Chernobyl were both 7s. So in China, I don't think there's anything ever higher than a 2. So it's like very minor, tangentially related to some safety related issue. That's the worst that's ever happened in China so far. Fingers crossed.
That's good. So we dove deep into nuclear right out the gate because it's something that Jason and I talk about a lot. But just kind of zooming out a little bit, I see this beautiful background behind you. So what's been pretty obvious to me as an engineer, and I've spent a couple of years at least in a solar adjacent field. I've installed a couple of solar panels on my father-in-law's barn in Iowa, and I understand how it works. I understand a lot of the arguments pro and con, but the thing that I have a hard time with is really understanding my own country's energy policy because it seems a bit one-sided. So I'd love to get
a lot of people have trouble understanding your country's energy policy.
So, okay. So I was curious because I'm just a hobbyist, right? I understand physics roughly, right? I'm an engineer. I'm not a physicist. I don't have a PhD in any of this. I'm more of an entrepreneur than an engineer at the end of the day. But you are very much boots on the ground, advising people on this stuff. So what's your take? Like, what's a reasonable energy policy for a country to have? Maybe that's too big of a question, but
such a simple question. All you want to know is what's a reasonable energy policy? Well, let me just pull out my reasonable energy policies.
Why don't we frame it another way? What's unreasonable about what Germany's trying to, or is what Germany's trying to achieve unreasonable? And if so,
any kind of policy, almost any kind of policy, can be reasonable if the expectations for it are set appropriately and calibrated appropriately at the beginning, right? Expectation management for your heavy industry, for your citizens, for your residential power users. This is really what matters, right? That's how you carry on a policy or a certain policy platform over the space of multiple administrations, that everybody kind of understands where you're going and why you're going and what's it going to take to get there? What are the trade-offs that are going to happen, right? If you say we're going to remove a certain type of generator from our system, and in Germany's case, it was nuclear, and we're going to replace it with a different type of energy over a period of time, that's not necessarily an unreasonable proposition as long as you explain very clearly what's going to happen and everybody's on board with it, or a majority of people are on board with it, right? And it does feel like there was a failure to appropriately explain and forecast what was going to happen, or at least to say it clearly enough to people so that they knew what they were getting into and they could choose whether they really were into that or not. If you're going to take out certain types of generators that behave in a certain way, in the case of nuclear, they are dispatchable, they are firm, the word baseload is maybe going away a little bit, but certainly they behave in a certain way that we used to call baseload that has a certain effect on the performance of the system and on the cost of power. And you're going to replace it with something else. We say we're going to replace it with wind and solar. They are variable generators. Sometimes they are there, sometimes they are not. In order for them to be an increasingly large part of our grid, we have done our modeling, we've done our forecasting, we've done everything that we can to reasonably understand what the future looks like. And we believe it's also going to require this many batteries, and it's also going to require this many load-following gas-fired power plants, and it's going to involve this many imports of nuclear power from France during certain times of the year. And all of these things are going to have the cumulative impact on our industry of making our tariffs go from here to here. Is that something everybody's cool with? Do we understand the trade-offs here? It feels like that step was, if not glossed over, at least not really done in a way that everybody felt like they had clear eye on what was going to happen. Because now we have a pretty large group of people who seem pretty unhappy with the outcome and maybe surprised by the outcome. It's not that the drawbacks of wind and solar or a highly variable renewable system are unknowable or unforecastable. There was perhaps just insufficient close look and widespread explanation of what was going to happen. That's the most neutral way I can explain that, I think.
No, you did a really good job. You did a really good job explaining it without stepping on any landmines, I think. And yeah, sorry for casting the question in such a unanswerable way. I think so. From my memory, right, there was an incident that was pretty grave. You had mentioned it before, Fukushima, and I think that politically, that incident was kind of exploited to push this across, right, and say, hey, we're going to be out of nuclear. And the timeline was 11 years at the time. Even at the time, as a college student, I actually thought this was a good move because, you know, nuclear bad is like the general German perspective. It was, even though I thought it was actually the right choice at the time, I thought that 11 years was not enough time to make such a decision, right? And it's just because you just told us how long it takes to build one of these plants, right? If everything goes smooth, 10 years. So on that scale, when you're trying to make changes on that scale, trying to replace a generator on an industrial nation's grid, 10 years is nothing, right? I mean, 11 years, right? That's pretty much just 10 years. And I don't think, I wasn't in the room, right? But I don't think that there was any of this in-depth studying that you just mentioned would need to happen. I think most of that was done after the fact.
I have a phrase I use online, on social media, on Twitter quite a lot. It's that activists make poor analysts. And I think when decisions are made from a foundation of activism, whether it's political or whether it's maybe an emotional place, which is where a lot of people might have been in the aftermath of the Fukushima accident, right? That even if the analysis was done, that it was performed in the spirit of activism, which yields perhaps non-credible or less credible analysis. I think that's broadly a problem everywhere, but you know, that does seem like in the spirit of the moment what might have happened if there was analysis done.
Hey, David, one other question. You mentioned just now we need to set expectations, right? So just back of the envelope, right? Rough calculations. When you say tariffs go from here to here, what are we talking about? Are we talking about 5% here to here? Or are we talking about a 3x here to here, right? Because I think most people in Germany don't really have that grasp of the magnitude of the difference in costs that we're talking about and what that means, not just for them keeping the lights on at home, but for companies like Volkswagen to continue churning out cars, right? So could you just let our audience understand what that means? Because I know when you increase volatility into a system with these variable generators, you're also increasing the cost due to needing to hedge and needing to manage that volatility, or importing energy on a short time frame because you've got an unexpected loss of, let's say, solar or wind. So what does that mean for the industry, the economy, the society, when they make such a decision?
Yeah, when you look at, so you're a power user or you're, you know, Volkswagen, and you're looking at your power invoices and you imagine the different items. Sometimes as we residential power users, we might just see a single number on our bill, or perhaps there will be a little surcharge and some tax, and that's all the breakdown we get. Commercial and especially industrial power invoices around the world tend to be a little bit more granular, and they'll tell you more things about what you're paying for, especially if you were a contestable power customer and you're competing, there's multiple power sellers competing for your business. And so you'll see there'll be the cost of energy, or sometimes we call it the cost of electrons, right? That's the power part. And then you have your transmission and distribution, the charge that comes from the grid to carry the power to where you are. And then there will be taxes and there will be surcharges in there associated with special funding vehicles or certain, maybe they want to power a hydropower project somewhere. And so there's an end user surcharge, something like that. All of those items can change, and they can change quite a lot. So if you were trying to look at what's going to happen to my industrial power tariff, my factory's power bills as a result of a certain industrial policy, well, you'd try to imagine at some point in the future, in the year 2030, what is going to be the average weighted cost of electrons that will be in the system that I will be buying. Okay, that's one of my charges. Now, for that specific average weighted cost of electrons, considering the makeup of the grid in that moment, the capacity that's available or not available, or providing its different roles, what are going to be the transmission and distribution costs. Now, transmission and distribution costs includes the costs to build new transmission wires, distribution grids, substations, all the physical infrastructure, but also in many countries, it will probably be in the T&D fees, would be your system operation costs. And system operation costs might include things like capacity fees. So a capacity fee would be or a capacity generator is a generator that is paid to be available in the system just in case you need them. You're not actually buying their power. You're not actually using their electrons, but you might need it at some point if the sun goes behind a cloud, or if there's a sudden failure of a wind farm, or if a nuclear power plant trips, something, right? So you have some backup capacity in there, that there might be a capacity charge that's always there, that's inside your system operation costs, inside your T&D fees. Then you might also have something like load following. So load following is what happens if, the wind dies down for a second and then it comes back and then it goes away, then it comes back. Another generator somewhere in the system had to follow up and down as the output of the variable generator changed. Maybe it was a battery farm or a pumped hydro storage facility or a gas-fired power plant, but there was somebody providing the flexibility for the variable generator to do what it did while keeping the whole system stable. We'd call that maybe a load follower, or a peak smoother, or a valley filler, right? That's also a service that's being provided to the grid. That will go into those system operation fees that go into the T&D charges. So when you try to imagine that future world, you should be considering those. Now, what if we wanted to offer a subsidy to the wind generators for building that farm? Well, maybe the country has established a national wind subsidy surcharge, and that's being assessed to C&I end users. All right, well, now we have that little bit in there too. When you start imagining what that future world is, you should be imagining all of those different components. One thing that you'll frequently see is, if you introduce a lot of wind and solar into a system, the average weighted cost of power should go down because the marginal cost of wind and solar is zero. Right? It costs no fuel to generate the next kilowatt hour of wind power or solar power. And that's on the wholesale side. That will be true. But then what happens to your transmission and distribution costs or your system operations fees? We know that there are going to be batteries in there. We know that there are going to be load followers in there, and they're going to be doing something to your costs. Is it going to be plus 10%, plus 20%, or plus 100%? It's really not clear. That's a question for the system modelers. Depending on how variable your system is, the penetration rate of the renewables, the cost of your thermal fuels, the cost of your capacity generation, which could be set by policy or could be set by a market. Right? You could have different capacity generators competing for the right to offer that capacity service. All of these things have to be forecasted, either through a market economic logic or through a policy logic. And when you stack all those things together, that's how you arrive at a number where you say, we think it's going to be 5%, 50%, or 500% more expensive than where we stand right now. How those should be calculated becomes more of a matter of art rather than science. That's why there's so much room for different forecasts about how the introduction of a wind farm or a solar farm or a gas generator or a nuclear power plant will change your future tariffs.
So there was thank you for breaking that down. I think having that in such detail explained is very rare, and you did it in a language that I think people can understand as well. So thank you for that. There was an interesting incident, right, that happened. I'm not super clear if it originated from France or Spain or Portugal, but the fact of the matter is that a lot of that part of Europe went dark. And then in the aftermath, it was a bit of figuring out, okay, how did this happen? And there was a article that I came across where some figurehead in the United Nations in July, Antonio Guterres, was talking about that the investment ratio for renewables, there's a pretty clear ratio that needs to be met, that you can bring on as much renewable as Spain is right now, which is impressive. But at the same time, it seems that the infrastructure investments for the distribution of that power and all these factors that you just mentioned, right, maybe was out of balance. So he's proposing, for every dollar or euro or won that you spend on renewable, you also need to spend one on the infrastructure. Would you say that this is roughly right?
Well, I can't tell you the numbers. Is it 1-to-1 or 1 to anything? But the logic that's underneath it is a question of probability. Mm-hmm. There's always a chance that something can go wrong. What is the chance that the sun goes behind a cloud tomorrow? Probably pretty high. What do I need to protect myself from it? Okay, well, let's say I need one battery for every one solar farm I have, right? We'll just do units. Need 1 unit of battery for every 1 unit of solar farm. Well, okay, what happens if the sun goes behind the cloud for 2 minutes? What is the likelihood of that? Oh, still pretty high. Okay, now I need 2 units of battery for each 1 unit. You start working up to higher and higher probabilities. You say, do I need 10 units of battery for each 1 unit of solar? Do I need 20 units? What is the appropriate ratio of backup to hedge against normal variability, expectable, reasonable levels of variability? And here we get into this world of probabilistic risk assessment, which is a great favorite of engineers, because you can't design anything to never fail, right? You design it to fail at a threshold of rarity for which you can accept. This will fail once in 10,000 years. This will fail once in 100,000 years, right? These are levels that I can't really fathom what 100,000 years is, but it feels big to me, feels safe. You
Right.
design to a threshold that seems probabilistically appropriate. You take that same perspective of probabilistic analysis and you apply it to power sufficiency and capacity sufficiency. How much backup is necessary? If we have an extremely high variable renewable system and those variable renewables don't offer any inertia to the grid, then how many backup sources of inertia do we need to have? So that's why some of the final results out of that came. They said, well, it was the renewables, but it wasn't the renewables. It was because they didn't create enough inertia, but it wasn't because if we had more inertia providers, then maybe it wouldn't have been a problem. So was it actually a system design problem instead? When you introduce all these variable generators, are you increasing your probabilistic need for backup in a way that was, well, they assigned a value that was too low. Their probabilistic need was higher than they thought it was, and so they need to redesign the system. That's the world we get into with renewables, and when we think about backup capacity and robustness of the entire grid system. And it's changing constantly. Again, that's also an art and not a science, because historical performance is increasingly showing itself to be a bad predictor of the future, because historical performance was based on a climate that we don't have anymore. We have a different climate. We have one that has hotter weather and stranger weather patterns and more susceptible to droughts and all these things. Our future climate and the system that we have to design that will be ready for it is different from the climate that we had for the last decades. It's very, very difficult.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So we've kind of talked about the things that aren't maybe going as well as they could in the West. But so could you contrast it a bit, like, and completely open? I'm not expecting you to say, yeah, but China is better in every way because, but so just from your boots on the ground experience, like how does China approach it? Just contrasting it.
Yeah, and one more point to add, and I
China
don't know if
overdesigns.
I'm observing it correctly, but it seems like when China adds on renewable capacity, it's not at the expense of other forms of energy. It's not like they're slowing down with building their coal-fired power plants or their nuclear power plants, or they're not shutting them down, at least, right? Compared to how I see Europe and in the US, it seems like renewables, going at breakneck speed with installations, but not really the other forms of energy. I'm hoping you can also comment on whether that observation is accurate or not.
Yeah. So 2 parts to the question, right? First part, in terms of how China builds everything, it's supply driven. It's always supply driven. It's always supply upfront. And so that means the supply will always be out ahead of the demand. We'll have more capacity. We'll have more supply than we need. When it comes to developing capacity, that means additive, not substitutive. Not yet. So the wind and solar gets built, but not really retiring any coal capacity. Instead, in fact, still bringing on more thermal capacity at the same time. Now, eventually, we get to a point where the capacity is replaceable, right? Where we say we don't even need this coal-fired power plant anymore. Every function that it was doing can be fully offset or has already been made obsolete by what we have in the system. By and large, it's quite tricky for wind and solar to do that, though, right? You need quite a lot of wind and solar, and then you need that much more of batteries before you could start to feel comfortable in saying this much wind and solar and batteries is equivalent to the stability and robustness of this one coal-fired power plant, so we can just retire it. What you do see in the substitution is in the generation. Capacity not getting substituted, generation absolutely getting substituted. All the wind and solar and hydro and nuclear that comes on They generate, they perform at very high, like whenever it's available, they use it. And because it's being used, that is 1 kilowatt hour of coal-fired power that's not used. That's generally these wind, solar, hydro, nuclear are all cheaper on a megawatt basis or megawatt hour basis than coal-fired power, at least in China. That's not true everywhere, but it is in China. And so they're happy to offset the thermal power. And so when we get into the generation question, we can see very clearly that the wind and the solar and everything, they do offset and they do compete with and push the coal out of the market. We see the evidence of that from the annual capacity factors. So coal-fired generators, they operate about 46% of the time, something like that, on an average annual basis across China. That's very, very low. That's partially because they're being offset by renewables and partially because they're competing with each other. There's too much supply. So they're cannibalizing each other's business. They drive each other's business down, and they're also fighting and losing market share to all the new renewables that are coming online. But if you want to do it long term, you want to get coal capacity out of the system entirely. Nuclear can do it. Bring on 1 nuclear power plant, you can retire 1 coal plant, no problem. Bring on a gas-fired generator, you can retire a coal plant. Bring on a big hydropower facility, you can retire a bunch of coal plants. But it is tricky otherwise.
Cool.
So I wanted to ask, right, with all you were talking about how China adds solar and wind on without taking things away. So it's additive, right? Not substitutive. Yeah. So when they do that, do they back it up with battery backup straight away? Or is it something that they're happy to allow to come online in time to come?
So until recently, all new build wind and solar in China was mandated to be built together with a certain capacity of batteries. It was matched to the size of the solar or the wind farm. So it would be maybe 10% of the nameplate capacity of the solar farm for 2 hours must be matched with batteries. And that was the obligation. The developer had to prepare that much batteries in order to build their project. Recently, that requirement has been abolished, and now the battery requirement is based on market need. If you, the builder, decide you think you need batteries, then you can build them, but otherwise it will not be driven by a mandate. And we're still going to see, I guess, if that results in individual economic behavior, individual market participants choosing to build batteries, and that will result in sufficient batteries, or if we need a government mandate to make sure we have enough batteries.
Okay. Well, interesting. So they are quite market leaning, right, when it comes down to it. They start off with some mandates, but they see when they can to allow the market to make decisions.
Yeah, well, that's where the whole power market is going. The power industry has been one of the very last segments of the Chinese economy to liberalize and decentralize. There are still a few other very centrally regulated segments like coal or steel or telecommunications, things like that. But electricity is moving towards marketization. It's a big one. It's a really, really big, important, kind of critically strategic one to allow markets to drive and determine. But that's where they're going with the price of power and with the price and the decision-making about how much to build and the auxiliary services like batteries.
So, okay. So, David, you touched on earlier about how when we go ahead with changing the direction of our generation, we need to also match that with the expectation that we're selling to the public, right? So recently I've heard a lot about net zero and everyone's saying that it's possible. And people on the street, really friends of mine who have never really worked in the energy industry can be telling me they really believe in net zero. And when I go on, let's say, ChatGPT and I have a conversation and I go, hey, if we were to really go off all forms of thermal generation and take Germany as an example, or the UK perhaps, and we want to be run totally on wind, solar, and batteries, what are we talking about? How much would this cost? What's the, let's say, without thinking about the economics of it, let's just talk about the sheer scale of, let's say, molecules that we need from critical mineral reserves globally, right? And ChatGPT comes back and says, at first it's, really, really optimistic, saying, yeah, this is good, blah, blah, blah. But then at the end, when I'm pushing it and going, hey, how much lithium do we need? Nickel do we need? what's that compared to the reserves we have of these minerals globally? They come back and say, for a country like the UK or Germany, singular, to go totally net zero, run on batteries, they would need global reserves. Like all known reserves of these few minerals would need to be totally exhausted. So how is that so far away from what we're being told? Like, if you sold to the average German, hey, if you want to really go net zero, it would mean the rest of the world would not be able to, plus they would have no access to battery technology, blah, blah, blah. They would probably say, hey, that's not realistic. But they're not being told that, right? So is ChatGPT off? Or what's your view on the whole net zero thing?
Okay, so first, ChatGPT can be convinced of almost anything. If you come back with like a thoughtful response, you say, "I think you're really underestimating the potential for this." ChatGPT will respond and say, "You're right. I might be underestimating the potential for that." You can convince it of anything.
Yeah.
But so I'll give you a couple different versions of the argument, right? There's the version that says, based on existing industrial needs, transport needs, power needs, building needs, right? What would it take to replace every single thing that we use fossil fuels for, or that incurs carbon emissions right now? And can we turn it into electricity? That's like first the really critical question. How far can we get with electricity if we were going to just stack up all our exposure to electricity and not worry about anything else? And you can get reasonably far in a theoretical sense, maybe not technically or economically at the moment, but in a theoretical sense, we say, okay, all passenger transport, all vehicle transport, that can be electric, or it can be maybe biodiesel or something, synthetic fuels that came based from an electricity process. All right, we'll just check that one off. It's very ambitious, very difficult, very expensive, but we'll say theoretically possible. Aviation, okay, well, electric airplanes don't work, but maybe we could do sustainable aviation fuels, biofuels, maybe it can be whatever, right? Maybe we have a solution for airplanes. We say heavy industry, we need to create ethylene and formaldehyde and methanol and ammonia and 1,000 other important basic chemicals that turn into specialty and fine chemicals that drive every single part of our industrial life. Okay, well, there's quite a lot of fossil fuels in there. A lot of them, you can pursue a different way of heating. You can find electric resistance heaters for some. You can use electric ethylene crackers for petrochemicals production. You run into a couple issues in heavy industry, places where the carbon inside the coal is chemically inseparable from the production process. We think about things like coking coal, which is part of the production process of carbon steel. You cannot remove the carbon from carbon steel. Well, maybe we have an alternative method. Maybe we can use direct iron reduction with green hydrogen, right? There are ways through that one. Another tough one is cement. The breakdown, the combustion of limestone releases emissions. Like those are quite chemically inseparable from the production of cement. That one's, let's put a tack in that one. Maybe carbon capture will be our solution for that one, right? So you start going through all your different areas and you say, can we figure out power? Can we figure out heavy industry? Can we figure out transport? Can we figure out buildings? And what's the last 10% that we simply have no idea how to deal with? Carbon capture. That will be carbon capture. Okay, so already we're engaging a little bit of magical thinking because carbon capture is not ready for that role yet. But hey, you know what? We don't need it to be ready until 2040. Magical thinking, by 2040, we'll figure it out. Okay, what about all the rest? What about all the electricity? Well, a lot of those processes I was describing rely heavily on green hydrogen. Green hydrogen fulfilling lots of roles as a reducing agent in certain chemical reactions, as a feedstock for ammonia and methanol, maybe as an energy storage, right? Well, how are we doing on the economics and kind of feasibility of massive electrolysis of green hydrogen? Okay, a little bit of magical thinking might be required to get us over that hump too. But okay, let's just keep going with our thought exercise, right? Then we get into the one you just asked about. Do we even have enough copper, molybdenum, nickel, all these critical minerals and metals? And that's where the critical thinking, where the magical thinking becomes really tricky, at least at the moment. It requires you to say, because lithium will become a bottleneck, sodium ion batteries will take over. They're not quite there. They're not ready for game time yet, but they will be, because they'll have to be, because we'll run out of lithium. Because this critical mineral will become the bottleneck, this other thing will have to become the chore. We'll have to put all our eggs into a different basket. It's not copper anymore. It's something else. It's vanadium flow batteries. It's deep geothermal, right? There are multiple areas of wishful or magical thinking involved in the 60-year energy transition. So there's two ways to think about that. First, you can scoff at it and say, so much magical thinking, so much idealism. How could that possibly happen? Fair. Not like, I'm not going to bash you for thinking that there's a lot of rampant enthusiasm, rampant optimism going on here. But the other way to look at it is, look, where were we 15 years ago with solar panels and the cost of solar panels? Where were we with the cost of lithium-ion batteries? Who could have imagined 20 years ago that electric vehicles would be cheaper than internal combustion engines? That we have engineered our way out of some of those corners that we got stuck ourselves into, and we're just going to keep engineering our way out of it. Engineering and markets and the logic of like chasing profit returns, right? Because lithium ion is not going to be viable, therefore the wisdom of markets and perhaps the power of a little bit of state industrial policy will make something else viable. Still a little bit of wishful, magical thinking, but it hasn't failed us too much yet. And so I can accept in the next 10 to 15 years that we can make an awful lot of progress without invoking any kind of magical thinking. That's absolutely true. We can make so much progress without invoking magical thinking. And then by 2035 to 2040, some of those magical ideas need to become a little bit more real.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense, right? I mean, the optimism of an inventor or an innovator has to be unbridled, otherwise they would never try to take a chance, right? And so I think this is actually maybe a good bridge to talking a little bit about, okay, why are we talking about energy policy on a largely freedom-focused podcast in the first place? Let me try to bridge it, and then Jason, you can come in and fix it. So I believe that access to energy is not optional if you want to live a peaceful, prosperous life. And if you can have peace and prosperity, I think ultimately things like freedom emerge and become attainable on an individual basis. And so, there's a lot of debate, I think, going around. It's like, well, this is, the economy is this one thing, and then there's energy, that's the other thing. And, it's got to be enough energy for this thing called economy to work. But somehow they're not the same thing, right? But I think you could very easily make an argument that without energy, there can't be an economy. Energy is economy, right? And so I think that and since a lot of the pursuits that we have in life are the pursuits that we have in business, right? Every business is run by people. And so I think that being able to go the entrepreneurial route as a choice in your life and figuring something out, solving hard problems, like people derive a lot of meaning from that. And I think that this is how on a philosophical level, people have a way to self-actualize by pursuing stuff like this. And anyway, on the base level, though, if there's no electrons coming out of your outlet, if there's nothing you can use to have mobility, if mobility is crushingly expensive or it's just not available, how are you going to go and ever self-actualize? So I don't know if that's a good enough bridge, but I wanted to get your view on this from a more personal level, David. What does energy really mean to everyday life for people?
Yeah, look, it's a very appropriate question because it is a greater awareness of this was what got me into the industry in the first place. It was, starting some of my classes in school looking at energy security and energy availability in Asia, and then coming to the realization, at the time it was 2012, 2013, realizing that it was actually specifically the country of Indonesia. And at the time, I was reading that Indonesia electrification rate was about 75%. And it's much higher now. It's actually getting pretty close to 100% because they've done such an excellent job with their rural electrification campaign in the last 12 to 15 years or so. But at the time, I remember thinking 75%. I know Indonesia is one of the most populous countries in the world. So it's like almost 100 million people, 70 million, 80 million people in Indonesia that don't have electricity in 2012. Like, That's incredible. What does it mean to live without electricity? What does it mean to be in energy poverty, right? To not even have low levels of energy consumption, but the only energy you're consuming is biomass, right? We're talking about firewood, essentially, because you're not electrified. And then the sobering realization that even today in 2025, there's still something like, I think it's close to 1 billion people in the world that don't have electricity. And so when we talk about energy availability, what does it mean to me? It's the symbol, it's a standard of a modern, prosperous life for most people. And that we still have a massive section of the world in 2025 that even can't even get to the lowest tier of energy equity, of an equitable consumption level of energy beyond the very, very basics, which is biomass and animal dung, dried animal dung for cooking fires and for heating, right? And compared to then countries that are coming up on the development scale where they have access, high levels of access to electricity, maybe 98, 99% electrified, but their per capita consumption of electricity is still so low. We're talking about just a single light bulb or a single outlet to charge a cell phone, right? And then we compare to the extreme other end of the spectrum, North America, right? North America and Australia generally have the highest rates. Canada and the United States have the highest rates of per capita electricity consumption almost in the world, with the exception of some small nations. And there's a common quote that says, a North American refrigerator uses more electricity than like 50% of all the humans on Earth do in a year. Right, just a single refrigerator. And so this level of electricity abundance and energy abundance, for me, energy is a question of equity. Energy is a question of international, global equity, and being unable to, in this year of 2025, unable to offer energy equity to the world falls right up there along with the other great failings of the International Development Project, hunger and poverty and energy availability. So for me, energy is the symbol of the future, but also it should be the symbol of now. It's the standard for modern humanity.
Yeah, thanks, David. Just to contextualize that just a little bit, right? When people think of electricity and if you're unelectrified, what does that mean? Or it means I don't have the internet, I don't have a phone, right? But I was in the Solomon Islands and in Honiara, and I was talking to a guy, and he had a big scar on his arm, right? And he said he was doing something in construction, and the galvanized tin roof fell and sliced his arm open. And he said he thought he was going to die because when he went to the local hospital, basically what they then have to do is the nurses and the doctors start running on the street to ask people if they want to come in to donate blood because they don't have electricity for refrigeration. So what they need to do in that few minutes is to test this guy's blood type and then to get the volunteers to come in and test their blood type. And if they manage to get the same blood type, they'll then hook them up to each other while they stitch him up, right? And so he said he was already sure he was a goner, but he was just sitting there. He was almost passing out. And then he woke up with stitches in his arm saying, oh, they found someone. And the guy's smiling at him saying, hey, good luck, right? So electricity. So for me, I did environmental engineering. And yeah, for me, electricity was always also a huge deal. That's also why I got involved with solar back in 2013. I wanted to know how that could work because I think growing up in Southeast Asia, you mentioned Indonesia, I think solar, a lot of times in very rural island type populations, for them, having a few 100 watts of solar power is just so much easier and faster than waiting for somebody to build a power station or using diesel, right? So yeah, thanks for breaking that down. I agree by and large with what you're saying. So what do you think now that you've got a global view on things, being from the US and having seen how China goes about doing this? What are some things that both sides can maybe learn from each other, you think?
Well, when it comes to the development of energy in China, and it has been, I mean, the numbers, the statistics, the evidence of an awful lot of competence when it comes to the development of energy infrastructure in China coming out of the last few years. I think one of the great takeaways from all of this is going to be, well, a couple things about the nature of the development of this kind of infrastructure, that getting out ahead of it on the supply side, which is, from an economics perspective, economically inefficient. Building out supply, especially a lot of supply, in advance of the demand, with the anticipation of the demand catching up, or the hope that the availability of the supply will stimulate the demand to catch up, is something that is, from a pure economics perspective, fairly wasteful. If you build in advance of when you need it, you could say those resources could have been used for something else. Why not try to build just enough, just in time? And so you're never wastefully deploying any resources. I think the experience that we're going through right now and of the last 5, 10, 15 years has taught China and will continue to teach China that supply-driven expansion and abundance on the supply side will be the default mode. And I do think for many parts of the rest of the world, that should also be a standard to strive for. Unfortunately, I think in many countries, because that model of development does not maximize return on capital, does not maximize economic efficiency of the resources applied, that it will be scoffed at. It will be sneered at as an inefficient use of resources. And China can do that. China can choose to do that because the companies that participate in that model and the banks that enable that model are all, not all, but by and large, state-backed. And because they are state-backed, they can afford to have a slightly different mandate. They can try to be profitable. They're supposed to be profitable, but their mandate is primarily to do useful things that benefit the country and the economy and the people. That's what a state-owned enterprise normally is supposed to be chartered to do. And so they can enjoy that different mandate, and they don't have to be so maximally economically efficient with those resources if it means that they're getting out ahead of the demand and pursuing that different model. So that is something that I do hope the rest of the world can see, can observe happening in China and try to adopt some of. Now, things that China could be doing better. Look, China transitioned from a centralized system, a very centralized system in the electricity, coal, and sale of power. That entire chain was extremely regulated and centralized. And they've been deregulating and moving towards a marketized system so slowly. It has taken such a long time, and they've moved with every step with so much conservatism. Now, I do like a measured approach. I do like a thoughtful approach. I think they're going a little too slowly. I think they can afford to move more rapidly and move more rapidly towards more marketized systems, like what we see in Europe, like what we see in parts of the United States, like what we'd see in Australia, perhaps. I think there is sufficient regulatory and institutional capacity to move towards that more rapidly. And I think there is more tolerance for higher power prices, which is what will happen if you move towards a more deregulated system. In the short term, we would expect to see lower power prices because renewables penetrations are still low. When you introduce more renewables into the system, they tend to push costs down. But then after that, we're going to see system integration costs rising because of all those renewables. And they have to get comfortable with passing some of those costs on to the end user. China is terrified of passing higher energy costs onto its industrial segment, especially. And I really think they're going to have to get more comfortable with that as the years turns into decades, as we try to get closer and closer to that net zero target. I don't think they're going to get to net zero while also keeping power costs and energy costs broadly as low as they are right now. And I do hope that they push more assertively, like other more marketized nations have, towards that ultimate goal.
Would you say that China's ultimate goal is net zero?
Yeah, it's a stated policy target, a net zero 2060.
Okay, cool. I didn't know. So one thing that you mentioned earlier, which I found fascinating, is that the capacity factors of the coal-fired guys is actually pretty low, and for two reasons, right? Because on the generation side of renewables is already up there because it's typically cheaper, and on the other side, there's so much competition also for thermal coal that it gives them a really hard time to even turn a profit. So that strikes me as actually a really apt way to say, hey, if your goal is to get rid of thermal coal, for example, or carbon emitting power in general, making them compete kind of to the death, I mean, not to the death, but to insolvency anyway, is not a bad way to do it, right? And it's just such a stark contrast to, in Germany, I saw a video of a fairly new thermal coal plant that, I mean, it's been running for, I mean, not even 10 years. It was being demolished. And this is more like it's more an ideological statement than anything, right? There's actually no economic reason to do this. Money's already been spent to build it. So now we're just going to tear it down? Like that doesn't make any sense to me. So after my brief sermon, how do you think that this stuff, how do we get from like a technological, like physics or maybe political debate into this like ideological realm so quickly?
Yeah. How does physics become political?
Yeah, so it's interestingly, China is importantly also, not just interesting, but importantly, China is not particularly ideological about its energy transition. There's one part of it where it gets very ideological, and it's not the climate part of it, it's actually the environmental part of it, and that is a difference. China is very ideologically robust about the need to defeat pollution, about the need to create cleaner skies, cleaner air, cleaner water, a better environment for everyone, right? So it's very much environmentally centric. Only since, Paris, essentially, since the Paris Climate Accords, did we really get into a little bit more of that climate-focused commentary. And in other countries, it's extremely ideological, that it's a war between the fossil fuel industry and the renewable energy industry, and unfortunately, sometimes the nuclear industry as well, that it's very activist driven. And in China, it's very engineering driven, even when it's a question of improving the environment, or when it's a question of combating pollution or doing an energy transition. It's an engineering and economics question. It's not an activism question. And so whether or not one energy type can be replaced by another or not, or whether it should be or not, whether it should be considered clean or green or low carbon, or all these questions, it's very, for me, refreshingly and comfortably so the case that in China, it's just handled as a math question that you have to solve, instead of an ethics or morality question that you have to write many, many pages about. And that's the way China handles it. Other countries, I think, have gotten pretty bogged down by the ideology of it, unfortunately.
Yeah, I would completely agree. So, David, we've taken a lot of your time. So maybe in one of the closing questions, what is the inspiration behind your Substack, and why do you focus on like the less covered corners of China?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, the title of the phrase is, the title of the Substack is, I guess, pretty well known in the China studies, China watching space, but maybe not so much outside of it. Crossing the river by feeling the stones is a direct translation of a classic political economic phrase, a slogan that was used during China's reform era by one of Deng Xiaoping's economic advisors, a guy named Chen Yun. And Chen Yun had been pushing this phrase for many years, actually. His approach to economic reform was, we see the far bank, we know we want to cross the river. Get across the river means a lot of uncertainty along the way. We know there are some rocks along the way to guide our footsteps, but they're beneath the water, flowing water, so we can't see where we are. That means we have to take each step cautiously. We feel ahead with our foot for where the next stone is. We find that it's solid, and then we cross the river slowly in this fashion. And that has been used as this metaphor for China's reform process, which is not a big bang, not a shock therapy like what was done in the post-Soviet socialist states for their economic reforms, but cautiously, one step at a time, very conservatively. The exact approach that I said has been done, perhaps applied a little bit too conservatively in the power sector. And so that has been the broad approach for all of the Chinese economy. My writing specifically is this kind of, it's a combination of writing, traveling, and a little bit of light social ethnography, I guess, right? Trying to understand people and their lives and their communities and the economy that runs through their communities through talking to them, just through chatting with people, anyone that I meet, taxi drivers or guest house owners or people that work in a little store wherever I go. But instead of making it just a travel blog, otherwise it's really just me talking about how I had a great time traveling, trying to weave it into a broader commentary about what it means for maybe economic transformation of that region, for poverty alleviation in some rural areas in China, for how people are thinking about China's transition into an urbanized country, right? Trying to connect people's stories to a little bit of the bigger story. So that's what I write about at my Substack. I tweet about it on Twitter, on X, when I get good stories, when I have interesting experiences, and then I'll also post it to my newsletter, Crossing the River by Feeling the Stones.
Thanks, David. I highly recommend your Substack. We'll put a link to it. I read all that you put out on Twitter, on X as well. So thank you. I hope you keep doing that. I feel like I could keep talking to you for hours, but maybe we'll see if we can get you again for episode 2 at some point in the future. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
And that wraps up our main conversation. But we're not done yet. We're going into overtime, where Jason and I unpack some insights, reflect on what just happened, and connect a few dots. And go.
It's going to be good. David, what did you think, Jay? What was your impressions of him? You've never talked to him before, right?
No, I've only seen him on Twitter, said hi on Twitter, asked him, hey, please come on. I love your threads. I actually had not read his Substack. Sorry, David. Until he said yes to come on. And then I started reading through his Substack articles. You've sent me a few things. I've sent you a few snippets. Really enjoy it. And, for me, I love not only everything East and West, but also how they meet in the middle, right? And seeing relatively how different cultures deal with similar problems. Just so super interesting for me. And that's why I think David's stuff is so valuable. Yeah.
I agree, man. I think it is so mind expanding. Because, growing up in Germany, but then having spent tons of time in the US, it's always like, from the Western perspective, it's like, the center of the universe, right? Everybody's perception is like the West, the people in the West is the West, right? And it's like, well, we can look at other countries, how they do things. Like when an American says that, they mean Western Europe, right? They never really seriously considering looking at Asia or South America, anywhere else, how they would do things. And I think in large part is because in their mind, the rest of the world is still like a backwater. And that, of course, with that attitude, though, you're gonna miss when somebody else figures something out that's outside of your perception, right? Percepted reality.
Yeah.
And so while I thought David had some very interesting points on like kind of like the supply-led energy build out, that's definitely not something that you would do in the West, I think. But then I was thinking, and actually, had we not run into technical issues, I really wanted to ask that question. Because right now, what we're seeing is a shift in policy, energy policy in the West. In the US, a lot of people are now pro-nuclear, publicly, openly, which used to be a very taboo topic. But why is that shift happening, right? It's because all these mega tech companies have realized that to further AI development, energy supply is the bottleneck. And when these tech guys want something, it gets done. Because, we can go to any depth of rabbit hole to argue why that's the case.
At the end of the day, it is what it is.
At the end of the day, it is what it is, exactly. Whether they use their algorithms to make people believe things, or it's just, political donations, or it's just they have all the monies.
All of the above.
Yeah, all of the above. The so now, Microsoft, Meta, Google, all these guys are trying to figure out how can we get more power for AI. And one thing that strikes me with proliferation of this kind of tech, right? AI software, everybody goes for this hockey stick growth, right? If your software startup does well, then you're going to have that exponential growth at some point. And for that to happen, though, you have to have some level of, you can have a exponential efficiency increase, or otherwise you're going to need exponential build out of energy capacity. And that's just something that's like not been happening in the West at all. It's been stagnant at best, and sometimes slightly actually downward sloping, right? So how do you resolve that reality? And then China's approach to say, hey, we're going to build it, we're going to make it cheap, and we trust that demand will catch up with supply. That's not unreasonable.
Yeah, yeah. I guess in the past, if you go back 200 years, it was, hey, how much grain should we grow? And after you got tons of grain, you started to realize, hey, I can feed pigs with the extra grain, and now my population can eat sausages with their bread, right? And he said something to me that was very, very interesting. He said, the West doesn't like this method because it doesn't treat capital the best. It's not the best if you optimize for capital, aka capitalism, you want to do it just in time, right? But a lot of times with innovation, you're hoping that capitalism gives you enough abundance to then allow you to have that space and time to then innovate, right? So the Chinese, maybe with their communist mindset and their philosophy of, hey, let's build abundance for the people, they go and say, hey, capital is not the most important, abundance is. So then they skip that step and they go direct into state planning, central planning, and they allow for capital to then be put into not the most efficient use, but maybe more effective, because they go, hey, we're going to build out all these electrical infrastructure, and now we have so much more than we need. Oh my gosh, we got that deep seek moment. We're in a well-positioned place to then leverage off that. And the funny thing is, they actually use capitalism on one level below, on the sub-level. They go, hey, the state says we need to build out a lot of electrical infrastructure. But then they allow capitalism or meritocracy or whatever you want to use, competition, let's say, between the different companies, the state-run companies, and the different forms of electricity production, right? And that's why he's saying, hey, coal is getting out-competed and they might get pushed out. So it's not that they disregard and don't use competition at all. They just inject it at a different point in time. So I wanted to ask, actually, hey, super good point what you're saying, right? What the West can learn from China and what China can learn from the West. But at some point, when there is abundance in China and they are allowing things to happen like we saw when we were there, and you extrapolate that 10 years, at some point the West has to go, oh my gosh, we need to change this, right? We need to do it, even though it might not be the best from a capital point of view.
Government is in the West, and I assume it's the same in China, but the government is typically the poorest capital allocator there is anyway.
And they burn capital while allocating capital.
Yeah, and so, but I missed the other point I was going to make, but it's like if the capital gets treated that well in the West is kind of what I was going to say, because a lot of times I feel like that money goes someplace. We're still completely overburdened with debt, and we don't have a fancy high-speed rail to show for it.
Right.
We don't have power prices, which you told me, Jay, and we should have asked David, but we don't have power prices of 7 cents during the day and 4 cents at night. Right,
yep.
Equivalent.
Yep.
Paying a balmy 35 to 40 in Germany, and it's and so it's like, yeah, okay, you can of course say, well, that's not the kind of capitalism that we like in China. The state allocate is very centrally planned, etc. Tons of justified criticism can be levied at that. At the same time, though, I don't think that we're doing better in the West. I think
Yeah.
we're actually get poorer results and we spend just as much or more money. So that's the thing where I get kind of a bit ticked off, and I'm like, well, then so what? So then let it be the Chinese model because it gets the results, right?
Yeah. So I think the question is, do you want to be empirical about it or not? So if you want to talk philosophy, that's fine. But then you also have to talk about the execution of that philosophy. And empirically speaking, they're worlds apart right now, right? You can take a snapshot of where we are right now. How much is electricity costing? How much is food costing? What's the life expectancy, etc., etc. That's all fine and good. Then that gives us where we're standing now. How are we performing right now? But then you put on another layer of debts. China doesn't owe the rest of the world, remember Rick Rule, Arithmetic of America? China doesn't have that. China's not drowning in debts, taking a third of their receipts to pay off interest, right? Why? So going into the future, there's a lot more headwinds for the West because they need to deal with that debt problem some way or another. Inflate it away or pay it off. And both will cause these costs of living to take a hit even more.
Yeah, even
Right.
more. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So I think creating abundance in your system is definitely a great way to allow innovation to happen as well. It's something I'm intimately familiar with, but it's incredibly tough to be innovative. So it's a twofold thing. I always think it's a twofold thing. It is incredibly tough to be innovative if you have a shoestring budget and you just don't have any time to spend on something and you have no money to experiment, because every failure hurts, right? Like that's tough. On the other hand, if you're too well funded and you get too much time and like no pressure to do something at all, I think innovation also doesn't work. And I think that's a big problem that's facing, mega corporations globally, to be honest. Once you have a too comfortable of a spot and basically you know exactly where all your revenue is going to come from for the next couple of years, why risk anything, right? Just enjoy. So it's a twofold thing, right? But I definitely think that the level at which these things happen matters also a lot. And I think that goes to your point. So I think you can definitely layer, hey, this is what we kind of want here. And we're going to decide this even on a national level, we're going to make this plan. And then, but how we're going to get there, there's tons of room for interpretation and obviously actual competition, right? Not the fake kind where winners are picked ahead of time. And then if somebody goes bankrupt along the way, you also got to let him go. You got to let him go bankrupt, because holding on to that, and that you're just creating a bloated system. That's something that I found so impressive with all the accounts I've heard about China. And again, I'm sure it's not 100% of the time either, but so many scrappy entrepreneurs, take massive risk, and if it doesn't work out, then they go bust, and nobody's there to save them, right? No.
Yeah, they go back to the village and start living at home again until they figure out their next move, right? Or some go to jail. Some go to jail. Some even get, a knock on the door and say, "Hey, you misappropriated these funds."
Well, if you did something illegal, then I think you should. But
Yeah.
right, I mean that's also part of it. That's called accountability, right? If you not for tanking a business, but if you did something illegal, right, then for sure. Yeah. So anyway, I find David's perspective, so by proxy, right, I find him very refreshing because of what he's talking about is very refreshing. Same as he said, it's very much based in reality and the numbers rather than ideology. And I think that's one beautiful thing about China in general is this like absence of ideology. It's just whatever works, whatever gets the job done. We'll figure out how to do it as best we can.
I think you see a lot of that in Southeast Asia, East Asia, right? You see a lot of non-ideological thinking. Like ideology comes after you've done the basics, right?
Right.
You want to talk about how we allocate the surplus, fine. Because when he was going on about all the magical thinking needed for net zero, I was like, to me, it's crazy, right? That you're putting a civilization on the line to see if maybe these things work or not, you know? It's the cost. It's nobody's throwing shade at you for wanting to change the world, right? But to unilaterally put so much on the line that's not actually yours as a means to an end, that's to me the part that is very scary.
I mean, the argument always has been because the outcome will kill us all, right? And so in the face of total annihilation through climate change, any means is justified. I think that's how kind of that loop goes. The thing is, though, as you know, your accounts many times and David's also show you very quickly, well, one thing's going to kill you really quickly. Like if you go to a hospital that doesn't have electricity, chances are you're dead.
Exactly.
The other thing might kill you also, but very slowly. So let's use the time we got to find the best solution and not one that just sounds good.
Yeah.
Right?
Because what I'm hearing now, it's more the burn the ships sort of a mentality.
Yeah.
To achieving this goal that is not really properly defined. Nobody knows what it means in essence, right? I when I was talking about the going off these fossil fuels, right? He touched on the ammonia production. What people don't talk about is that if you don't use natural gas for ammonia production, which then gives you the Haber-Bosch fertilizer, chemical fertilizers, green revolution, abundance of food, you basically take away food for half the world's population. And how are you going to do that with green ammonia? If you can, fine, but then shut down these things after you've figured out how, right? Make it redundant. Then do it. Nobody's saying don't do it, but don't kill half the world's population while you're trying to do it, right?
Right.
Yeah. So to me, it's just anyway. I guess
Yeah,
after
but
this is
then Jay, in all seriousness, you have then people look you in the face and say, not with a specific population group in mind, but just in general terms, oh, that's good because there's way too many people anyway, and we're screwing over the planet, so it's good if there's less people.
yeah.
And I'm like, I mean, I don't. But then who do you pick, right? Who is across the line and who's behind the line?
Doomberg always says, "Oh, really? You first."
Yeah, exactly. Then great. What are you
Please.
doing taking up resources?
Yeah, exit stage left.
Yeah. So
Yeah, there
I don't
are
know.
these people, but it's this circular logic thing, right? Like, no matter how you argue it, at some point there's this get off the stage argument. You know, it's always binary. It's hey, it's annihilation if we don't do it. Hey, we have too much people anyway, so the costs are justified if people die because they're gonna die anyway. So who cares?
Yeah. Yeah, but this is where the timeline matters again, I think, right? So, but yeah. Great find. Thanks for bringing David on. I thoroughly enjoyed it. Definitely would love to have him back. And when we go back to China, I would really try hard to see if we can meet up with him in person.
Yeah,
That
same.
will promise to be a fun day to
Yeah, and I'll
meet
learn
him.
so much, right? Because it's so good for me to check some of my observations in with him who's really in the trenches. You know? So for example, when I said, hey, I think China doesn't shut down their primary electricity generation once they install solar, it's like on top, right? It was good that he said that, what did he say? It's additive, not substitutive, right? Yeah. And
Yeah, to a point though. To a point, right? And then so he's like, yeah, but from generation perspective, they are taking over because the way that. But this is the thing. Here in the West, everybody says, oh, because wind and sunlight doesn't cost anything, that's why that power is going to be is cheaper, right? And that's why they end it. And it's like it actually hasn't been true though in the West. Power is getting more and more expensive because it's mismanaged so much. In China, according to David, it actually is getting cheaper. So then there is preference to wind and solar when it's available. I was like, that's amazing. This is like one of the few places then on Earth where it actually works the way it's supposed to. right?
Yeah. So empirically, if we're real scientists and we're real engineers, then empirically speaking, you should look at what China's doing and try and do copy, right? But
Yeah.
we are not. We're not empirical. We are ideological.
Yeah. But yeah, and so it always baffles me though that people that anyway, it just baffles me. But yeah, I think it's good reminder, right? For you can't change the things, right? What is that saying?
Can't change
You
the
have to
world,
be
change yourself.
yes, exactly. So it's a good reminder for me personally to just be empirical and try to not to make these like logical leaps that end to self-defeating conclusions, basically.
Yeah. And it's how to bridge that gap, right? And don't get into the trap of people saying, oh, so you don't believe in climate change, or you want people to all die under 200 meters of seawater. It's not really. It's more like, hey, can we just focus on what we want to do that has actually worked?
Right.
Not base it off what you read in Die Zeit or the New York Times, right?
Yeah. I think due to the tech companies' push for more reliable, cheap power, I think there's going to be a big pivot in the West soon. I think that's going to be the driver, the catalyst for it. But then, of course, the stuff takes decades, right? I don't know. I don't know if Germany will ever bring nukes back online. They talk about it. I don't think they will. But I don't think it's going to matter much. Germany's very small. There's just going to be a bunch of them built around the perimeter.
Yeah, they'll find a way to import them from Poland or the Czech Republic or France. Right?
Exactly. And then that way Germany gets to sit on their high horse while not actually producing the result that made it possible, which is, I think that's pretty fitting for the current German the German condition. But yeah, anyway, pleasure, my friend. Thank you. And looking forward to next episodes.
Yeah, man. Thank you.